Sometimes the loneliest place on earth is a home that used to be full of love. For 10 winters, Elias Boone had lived alone in his mountain cabin, the memories of his wife keeping him company through the long, cold nights. Christmas Eve arrived like any other, silent, empty, just another day to survive. Then came a knock at his door. Standing in the snow was a young mother and her little girl, stranded and freezing. He brought them inside and shared what little he had. The child handed him a small package wrapped in paper. "Mama said no one should be alone on Christmas," she whispered. What happened next changed everything he thought he'd lost. What was in that package they carried through the snow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at 8,000 feet, where the pine trees grew thick and the wind never stopped talking. Elias Boone had built most of it himself, back when his hands were younger and his heart still held hope. The logs were chinked tight against the weather. The roof sloped steep to shed the heavy snows, and the stone chimney drew clean and true. It was a good cabin, built to last, built for a family that never came. Inside, everything had its place. The iron stove stood against the north wall, its surface worn smooth from years of use. A wooden table with 2 chairs, though he only ever used one, sat beneath the window that faced the valley. His bed was pushed into the corner, covered with heavy wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and thyme. Shelves lined the walls, holding tins of coffee, beans, flour, and the few books he'd read so many times he could recite passages from memory. On the small table beside his bed sat a wooden box, plain and unadorned. Inside, wrapped in a square of soft leather, was a simple gold wedding band, Sarah's ring. He never opened the box anymore, but he knew it was there, and that was enough. Elias was 63 years old, though the mountains had weathered him beyond his years. His beard was more grey than brown now, his hands scarred and rough from work and weather. He stood just over 6 feet, his frame still solid despite the lean winters. His eyes were the colour of winter sky, pale blue and distant, as though he was always looking at something far away. He had come to Whispering Pines 35 years ago, a young man with a strong back and dreams of owning land. He'd worked as a ranch hand for the Brennan family, breaking horses and mending fences, saving every dollar he could. That's where he'd met Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher who boarded with the Brennans during the term. She had been small and sturdy, with dark hair she wore in a practical braid, and eyes that sparkled when she laughed. She read books by lamplight and knew the names of all the stars. She had loved the mountains as much as he did, had seen the same future he saw, a ranch of their own, children running through the meadows, a life built on honest work and simple joy. They married in the spring of 1880, in the small church in Whispering Pines. Tom Whitmore had stood as his best man, grinning wide and clapping him on the back. "You're a lucky man, Eli," Tom had said. "Don't you forget it." He never did forget it. Not for a single day. They had 5 years together. 5 years of laughter and plans, of winter evenings by the fire and summer mornings when the world smelled like pine and possibility. Sarah had wanted children, 3 at least, she'd said, maybe 4. She'd already started collecting things, tucking them away in the cedar hope chest her mother had given her. Little gowns and blankets, a primer for teaching letters, a wooden horse Elias had carved during the long winter nights. But the children never came. And then, in the winter of 1885, Sarah caught pneumonia. The doctor from town came up through the snow, did what he could, but the fever took her in 3 days. She died in their bed, her hand in his, whispering that she loved him and that she'd wait for him on the other side. Elias buried her in the spring when the ground thawed enough to dig. He marked her grave with a white cross and planted wild roses around it, the kind she'd loved. Then he'd walked away from the life they'd planned and built this cabin in the high country, where the only voices were the wind and the wolves. For 10 years, he'd lived alone. He trapped in the winter, hunted when he needed meat, and kept a small garden in the brief summer. Once a month, he'd make the long ride down to Whispering Pines for supplies, flour, coffee, tobacco, lamp oil. He'd speak to the shopkeeper, pay in cash or furs, and ride back up the mountain before anyone could ask him to linger. The townspeople had stopped trying to draw him back. At first, they'd invited him to Sunday dinners, to barn raisings and harvest dances. But Elias had declined every invitation with polite firmness until they stopped coming. He wasn't rude about it. He simply preferred to be alone. Alone was easier. Alone meant he didn't have to pretend the world still held color. Alone meant he didn't have to watch other men with their wives and children and feel the hollow ache of what he'd lost. Christmas was the hardest. Sarah had loved Christmas. She'd made evergreen wreaths and baked bread studded with dried berries. She'd sung carols in her clear, sweet voice and insisted they read the Nativity story on Christmas Eve, even though it was just the two of them. She'd made it magical. Now Christmas was just another day to endure. On this Christmas Eve, Elias went through his usual routine. He fed the stove, adding split pine that caught quick and burned hot. He made coffee in the battered pot, strong and black, and ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush with a spoonful of honey. He checked his traps in the morning, pulling 3 rabbits from the snares, and spent the afternoon skinning and cleaning them. 2 he hung in the coal shed to freeze. When he'd stew for supper, the sky had been grey all day, heavy with the promise of snow. By late afternoon, the first flakes began to fall, small and dry, the kind that meant a long storm was coming. Elias brought in extra wood, stacking it beside the stove, and filled the water barrel from the spring before it froze over. As darkness settled over the mountains, he lit the lamp and sat at his table with a plate of rabbit stew and a hunk of bread he'd baked 3 days prior. He ate slowly, methodically, tasting nothing. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pines, and the snow began to fall in earnest. He thought about Sarah. He always thought about Sarah on Christmas Eve. He wondered what she would think of him now, living like this, shut away from the world. Would she understand? Would she be disappointed? He pushed the thoughts away and washed his plate in the basin. He added another log to the fire and settled into his chair with one of his books, a collection of Robert Burns' poetry that Sarah had given him their first Christmas together. He read, without seeing the words, the familiar verses flowing through his mind like a river he'd crossed 1,000 times. The storm raged outside, the wind shrieking and the cabin timbers creaking. It would be a hard night. He was glad to be inside, glad for the fire and the solid walls. He was just thinking about banking the fire and going to bed when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind. A knock at his door. Elias froze, the book still open in his hands. He waited, wondering if he'd imagined it. But then it came again. 3 firm knocks, deliberate and clear, even through the howl of the storm. Nobody came up the mountain in weather like this. Nobody came up the mountain at all. He set the book aside and rose slowly, every instinct telling him to be cautious. He crossed to the door and stood there, listening. The knock came again, weaker this time, and beneath it he heard something else, a voice thin and desperate. "Please." "Is anyone there?" It was a woman's voice. Elias lifted the wooden bar and pulled the door open against the wind. Snow swirled into the cabin, and standing on his threshold, half frozen and trembling, was a young woman with a small child clutched against her side. The woman looked up at him with eyes dark and desperate. Ice crusted her eyelashes and clung to the wool shawl wrapped around her head. The child in her arms, a little girl no more than 6, had her face buried against her mother's shoulder, her small body shaking with cold. For a moment, Elias could only stare. It had been so long since he'd seen another person at his door that the sight seemed almost unreal, like something conjured by the storm itself. "Please," the woman said again, her voice cracking. "Our wagon broke down on the trail. We've been walking for hours. My daughter, she can't go any farther." The wind gusted, driving snow into the cabin, and the decision made itself. Whatever caution Elias might have felt dissolved in the face of immediate need. He stepped back and gestured them inside. "Come in, quickly now." The woman stumbled across the threshold, and Elias shut the door behind them, dropping the bar back into place. The sudden absence of wind made the cabin feel almost silent. Just the crackle of the fire and the sound of the woman's ragged breathing. She stood just inside the door, swaying slightly, as if her legs might give out at any moment. The child still clung to her, face hidden. Both were covered in snow, their clothes soaked through. The woman wore a threadbare coat over a simple dress, and the little girl had only a thin cloak that did nothing against the mountain cold. "Sit," Elias said, pointing to the chair near the stove. "Get warm." The woman nodded and moved toward the fire, her steps unsteady. Elias pulled the second chair closer to the stove and helped her lower herself into the seat. She kept the child in her lap, wrapping her arms around the small body. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you. I didn't know if anyone lived up here. I saw the smoke from your chimney and I had to try." Elias knelt by the stove and added more wood, building up the fire until heat radiated in waves. The woman held her hands toward the warmth, and he saw they were raw and red, the fingertips white with the beginning of frostbite. "You said your wagon broke down." She nodded, teeth chattering. "About 3 miles down the trail, maybe 4. A wheel cracked when we hit a rut. My husband," her voice caught. "My late husband taught me how to change a wheel, but in this storm, in the dark, I couldn't manage it. And Lydia, she's so cold, and I thought we should find shelter. I thought maybe someone lived up here." "You thought right." Elias stood and went to the shelf, pulling down his coffee pot and a tin cup. He poured what was left of the morning's coffee, now lukewarm, but better than nothing. "Drink this." She took the cup with shaking hands and sipped gratefully. The little girl, Lydia, lifted her head slightly and looked at Elias with wide, frightened eyes. Her face was pale, her lips tinged blue. "The child needs dry clothes," Elias said. "I don't have much that'll fit, but anything," the woman said quickly. "Anything warm." He went to the chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out one of his flannel shirts and a pair of wool socks. They would be enormous on the child, but they were dry and warm. He brought them to the woman. "I'll turn my back. Get her out of those wet things." He moved to the other side of the cabin, facing the wall, and listened to the rustle of fabric as the woman undressed her daughter. He heard the child's small voice, barely a whisper. "Mama, who is he?" "A kind man, sweetheart. A very kind man who's helping us." When the woman said it was all right, Elias turned back. The little girl sat in her mother's lap, swimming in his oversized shirt, the wool socks pulled up to her knees. Her wet clothes lay in a heap on the floor. She had dark hair like her mother, and the same watchful eyes. "Your coat too," Elias said to the woman. "You're soaked through." She hesitated, then nodded. She stood, lifting Lydia with her, and shrugged out of the coat. Beneath it, her dress was damp but not soaked. Elias took the coat and draped it over the back of the chair near the fire, then did the same with Lydia's cloak and the pile of wet clothes. "I have stew," he said. "Not much, but it's hot. We couldn't." "You could and you will." His voice was firm but not unkind. "You need food and you need rest. We'll figure out the wagon in the morning." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them back quickly. "Thank you. I'm Clara Whitmore. And this is my daughter, Lydia, Elias Boone." He ladled what remained of the rabbit stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. Clara carried Lydia to the table and sat, settling the child on her lap. They ate slowly, carefully, as if the hot food might burn them. Elias watched as color gradually returned to their faces. As the shaking subsided, when Lydia had finished half her bowl, she looked up at Elias with those solemn eyes. "It's Christmas Eve," she said softly. "I know. Mama said we'd be at Uncle Thomas's ranch by now. She said we'd have a Christmas tree and everything." Clara smoothed her daughter's hair. "We'll get there, sweetheart. Just a day or 2 late." The little girl nodded, then reached down beside the chair where she'd been sitting. She picked up a small bundle wrapped in worn cloth and tied with twine, something Elias hadn't noticed before. She held it out to him with both hands. "Mama made bread," Lydia said. "She said we should share it with whoever helped us. She said no one should be alone on Christmas." Elias took the bundle slowly. The cloth was damp, but the bread inside was protected. He could feel its weight, solid and real. Something about the gesture, the generosity of it coming from people who had so little, struck him with unexpected force. He looked at Clara. She met his eyes with quiet dignity. "It's not much," she said, "but it's what we have to give." Elias turned the bundle over in his hands, feeling the careful way it had been wrapped, the knots tied secure. For 10 years, no one had given him anything. For 10 years, he'd needed nothing from anyone, but standing there in his cabin, holding this small offering from strangers who'd nearly frozen on his doorstep. He felt something shift inside him, a crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out rough. "That's kind of you." Lydia smiled just a little and leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. The fire crackled and the storm howled outside. But inside the cabin, for the first time in a very long time, there was the sound of other people breathing. The sense of life beyond his own. Clara finished her stew and set down the bowl. "Mr. Boone, I know this is an imposition. If you could just let us stay until the storm passes, we'll be on our way. I can pay you, not much, but something. Keep your money." Elias collected the bowls and set them in the basin. "The storm's going to last through the night at least, maybe longer. You and the child can have my bed. I'll sleep here by the fire. We couldn't take your bed. You can and you will." He said it in the same firm tone he'd used before, leaving no room for argument. "The child needs proper rest, and so do you." Clara looked like she might protest further, but exhaustion was written in every line of her face. She simply nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. Truly, Elias is fine." He pulled back the blankets on his bed and gestured for them to lie down. Clara carried Lydia over and tucked her in, then climbed in beside her. The child was already half asleep, her eyes drooping. Clara pulled the blankets up around them both. "Good night, Elias," Lydia murmured. "Good night." "Child," he turned down the lamp until just a dim glow remained. Enough to see by, but not enough to keep them awake. Then he settled into his chair by the fire, pulling one of the spare blankets around his shoulders. The cabin was quiet except for the storm and the fire. Elias stared into the flames, the wrapped loaf of bread resting on the table beside him. He thought about Clara's words, "No one should be alone on Christmas," and wondered if Sarah had sent them somehow, if this was her way of reminding him that he was still among the living. He didn't know. He only knew that for the first time in 10 years, his cabin held more than memories. It held hope. Sleep didn't come easily for Elias. He dozed fitfully in the chair, waking every hour or so to add wood to the fire. Each time he woke, he glanced toward the bed where Clara and Lydia slept, reassuring himself they were warm and safe. The storm continued to rage through the night, the wind battering the cabin walls and snow piling up against the door. By the time grey dawn light filtered through the window, Elias could see drifts nearly 3 feet high outside. The storm hadn't let up at all. If anything, it had grown worse. He stood slowly, his back stiff from sleeping in the chair, and moved quietly around the cabin. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. The familiar routine settled him, gave him something to do with his hands, while his mind worked through the situation. 2 strangers in his cabin, a woman and a child, the storm showing no signs of stopping, a broken wagon somewhere down the mountain trail, probably buried in snow by now. He should have felt intruded upon. He should have wanted them gone. But what he felt instead was something he couldn't quite name. A stirring of purpose, perhaps, or simply the recognition that he was needed. Behind him, he heard movement from the bed. He turned to see Clara sitting up, her hair loose around her shoulders. She blinked in the dim light, momentarily disoriented, then seemed to remember where she was. "Morning," Elias said quietly. "Good morning." She carefully extracted herself from the blankets without waking Lydia and crossed to the window. When she saw the snow, her face fell. "Oh, storm's not done yet. Could blow for another day or 2. Clara wrapped her arms around herself. She still wore her dress from yesterday, now dry but wrinkled. "I'm sorry. I know you didn't plan on having house guests. Nobody plans for a blizzard." Elias poured coffee into 2 cups and handed her one. but we're warm and we've got food. That's more than most can say in weather like this." She accepted the coffee gratefully and sipped it, closing her eyes as the warmth spread through her. For the first time, in proper light, Elias could see her clearly. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30, 32. Her face was thin but strong, with high cheekbones and a firm jaw. Her hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, were work-worn and capable. This was a woman who knew hardship, who'd survived it and kept going. "How long have you been widowed?" The question came out before Elias could stop it, too direct, too personal. But Clara didn't seem offended. 2 years come spring. James took sick with fever. He was gone in a week. She stared into her coffee. "Left me with a 6-year-old daughter and a dream of reaching his brother's ranch out west. Thomas wrote and said we could come, that he'd help us get settled. So I sold what little we had and bought a wagon and supplies. We've been traveling for 3 months. Long journey for a woman and child alone. I didn't have much choice." Her voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "Stay in Missouri and lose everything to debt, or head west and hope for something better. At least out here, there's land, there's possibility." Elias nodded slowly. He understood that kind of determination, that willingness to gamble everything on possibility. He'd felt it once himself, a long time ago. "Where's your husband's brother's ranch?" "Near Silverton. Another 2 weeks of travel. Maybe less if the weather holds. Silverton's a hard journey this time of year." "I know." Clara looked toward the bed where Lydia still slept. "But I promised James I'd get her there. I promised I'd give her a better life than what we had." There was fierce love in her voice. The kind of protective devotion that made a woman walk through a blizzard rather than give up. Elias recognized it. Sarah had wanted children with that same fierce devotion, had dreamed of giving them a life of safety and love. "Your daughter," he said. "She's a good child. Quiet, well-mannered." Clara's face softened. "She's had to grow up too fast. Since James died, she tries so hard to be helpful, to not be a burden. Sometimes I wish she'd just be a child, you know, play and laugh and not worry about anything." "She'll have time for that, once you reach your brother-in-law's place." "I hope so." Clara set down her coffee cup. "Mr. Boone, Elias, I meant what I said last night. We'll be out of your way as soon as the storm breaks. I know you value your privacy up here." He should have agreed. He should have confirmed that. Yes, he valued his privacy, that he'd be glad to see them on their way. Instead, he found himself saying, "No rush. Storm like this, it's foolish to travel until it's well and truly done." Relief flickered across Clara's face. "Thank you." Movement from the bed drew their attention. Lydia was sitting up, rubbing her eyes. When she saw her mother, she smiled. The first real smile Elias had seen from the child. It transformed her face, made her look less like a small adult and more like the 6-year-old she was. "Mama?" "Right here, sweetheart." Clara went to her daughter and helped her out of bed. Lydia was still wearing Elias's oversized shirt, the hem dragging on the floor. She looked around the cabin with curious eyes, taking in details she'd been too cold and tired to notice the night before. "Did it snow all night?" she asked. "It did. Still is." Lydia padded to the window and stood on her toes to see out. "It's so deep. Too deep for traveling," Clara said. "We're going to need to stay with Mr. Boone a little longer. Is that all right with you?" Lydia turned and looked at Elias solemnly. Then, to his surprise, she walked right up to him and held out her hand. "Thank you for letting us stay," she said, formal as a little lady. "You're very kind." Elias looked down at the small hand extended toward him. It had been so long since he'd touched another person with anything resembling affection. But the gesture was so earnest, so genuine, that he found himself reaching out and taking her hand gently. "You're welcome, Miss Lydia." She smiled again, and something in Elias's chest, something he'd thought long dead, stirred painfully. Clara began to help Lydia into her now dry clothes from the night before, and Elias busied himself with breakfast. He made cornmeal porridge and sweetened it with the last of his honey. It wasn't much, but it was hot and filling. They ate together at the table, and for the first time both chairs were occupied. After breakfast, Lydia explored the cabin with the careful curiosity of a child taught not to touch things without permission. She studied his books, running her fingers along the spines. She looked at the few items on his shelves: a coffee tin, a handful of nails, a coil of rope. Everything fascinated her. "Do you live here all alone?" she asked. "I do. Don't you get lonely?" Clara made a soft sound of dismay. "Lydia, that's not polite." "It's all right." Elias met the child's questioning gaze. "Yes, I suppose I do get lonely sometimes." "I get lonely too," Lydia said quietly. "Since Papa died, even though I have Mama, I still miss him." The simple honesty of it struck Elias hard. He saw Clara's eyes well up with tears that she quickly blinked away. "I understand that," Elias said. "I lost someone too, my wife, a long time ago." Lydia considered this. "Is that why you live up here by yourself?" "That's part of it." Did it help? Living alone? No one had ever asked him that before. No one had dared. But this child, with her grave eyes and honest questions, somehow made it feel like a reasonable thing to ask. "No," he admitted. "I don't think it did." Lydia nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small object. It was a doll, carved from wood, about the size of her hand. The doll wore a tiny dress made from scraps of faded fabric, and its face had been painted with simple features: 2 dots for eyes, a smile. "This is Mama Grace," Lydia said, holding the doll up for Elias to see. "My papa made her for me. I take her everywhere." "She's very fine. Papa was good at carving. He was going to teach me when I got older." Lydia hugged the doll close. "I don't want to forget him." "You won't," Elias said gently. "When someone we love is gone, we carry them with us, in here." He tapped his chest, over his heart. Lydia seemed to think about this. Then she nodded and tucked the doll carefully back into her pocket. The day stretched on slowly. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Elias kept the fire burning and made more coffee. Clara helped where she could, tidying the cabin without being asked, as if keeping busy helped her manage her worry about the wagon, the supplies, the journey still ahead. Around midday, Elias went out to check on things. The cold hit him like a fist, and snow immediately began to accumulate on his hat and shoulders. He fought his way to the shed where he kept his tools and traps, checking to make sure everything was secure. Then he pushed through the drifts to the small lean-to where he kept his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Red. The horse nickered at him, glad for company. Elias fed him hay and made sure his water hadn't frozen solid. He spoke to Red in low tones, telling him about the visitors in the cabin, as if the horse might have advice on the matter. When he returned to the cabin, snow-covered and half-frozen, Clara had hot coffee waiting. She'd also found his wash basin and heated water on the stove, and she gestured to it meaningfully. "I thought you might want to wash up," she said. "Lydia and I will step outside for a moment in this storm." "Absolutely not." Elias shook his head. "I'll just brush off the snow, I'm fine." But Clara had a stubborn set to her jaw that reminded him of Sarah. "Then we'll turn our backs. A man deserves some privacy in his own home." There was no arguing with her. Elias waited until she and Lydia had turned toward the far wall, then quickly stripped off his wet coat and shirt and washed his face and hands in the warm water. It felt good, that simple comfort. He dried off and pulled on a clean shirt from his chest. "All right," he said, and they turned back around. The afternoon passed quietly. Clara found Elias's mending kit and set to work repairing a tear in Lydia's dress. Lydia sat on the floor near the fire, talking softly to her doll, creating small adventures in whispered voices. Elias sat in his chair with his book, but found himself watching them more than reading. There was something peaceful about it. The domestic scene, the simple presence of other people. The cabin felt different, warmer somehow, despite the storm raging outside. It felt, he realized with the start, almost like a home. As evening approached, Elias took stock of his food supplies. He had enough for several more days, but they'd need to be careful. He made a stew with dried beans and the last of the rabbits, stretching it with potatoes from his winter stores. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would keep them fed. They ate dinner together, and afterward, Clara insisted on cleaning up. Lydia helped. Her, standing on a chair to reach the basin, her small hands carefully washing each bowl and spoon. "Bedtime, sweetheart," Clara said when the dishes were done. "But Mama, it's Christmas Eve. It's past Christmas Eve now. It's Christmas night." "I know, but—" Lydia looked at Elias hopefully. "Could Mr. Boone tell us a story? Just one?" Clara looked embarrassed. "Lydia, I'm sure Mr. Boone is tired. I don't mind," Elias heard himself say. "One story." Lydia's face lit up. She scrambled into her mother's lap in the chair by the fire, and both of them looked at Elias expectantly. He searched his memory for something appropriate, something a child would enjoy. Finally, he settled on a story his own grandfather had told him long ago, about a fox and a rabbit, and the winter they learned to be friends. He told it slowly, using different voices for the animals, and Lydia listened with rapt attention. When he finished, she clapped her small hands together. "That was wonderful, thank you, Mr. Boone." "Time for bed now," Clara said firmly. "No arguments." She carried Lydia to the bed and tucked her in. Elias heard them whispering together, heard Clara's soft voice singing a lullaby that drifted through the cabin like a benediction. When she returned to the fire, she moved quietly, settling into the chair with a sigh. "She'll be asleep in minutes," Clara said. "She always is after a story. It's been a long time since I told a story to anyone." "You did it well." Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "You said you lost your wife. Did she pass here, in the cabin?" "No, we lived down in Whispering Pines. She caught pneumonia one winter. Went quick. Even after all these years, it hurt to say it out loud. I'm sorry it was a long time ago. That doesn't make it easier." Clara's voice was soft with understanding. "Loss is loss, no matter how many years have passed." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire. Outside, the wind had died down slightly, though the snow still fell. "Thank you," Clara said finally, "for all of this, for taking us in, for sharing your home and your food. I know it's not easy having strangers intrude on your peace." "You're not intruding," Elias said, and realized he meant it. "You're welcome here. For as long as you need." Clara smiled, and in the firelight, Elias could see the beauty that hardship had tried to hide, the warmth in her eyes, the strength in her face. She reminded him just a little of Sarah. "Good night, Elias," she said, rising. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Clara." She crossed to the bed and climbed in beside her sleeping daughter. Elias stayed by the fire, listening to the storm, thinking about the strange turn his solitary life had taken. He thought about the wrapped loaf of bread sitting on his shelf, still unopened, a gift from people who had nothing yet gave freely. He thought about Lydia's question. Did it help, living alone? No, he'd told her, and it was the truth. Maybe, he thought, it was time to stop hiding from the world. Maybe it was time to remember that he was still alive, still capable of kindness and connection. Maybe, after 10 long years, it was time to come down from the mountain. He added another log to the fire and settled deeper into his chair, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. Tomorrow the storm might break. Tomorrow they might talk about fixing the wagon, about getting Clara and Lydia back on their way. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah died, Elias's cabin was full of life and warmth and possibility, and that, he thought, was gift enough for any Christmas. Morning came quietly. The storm had finally passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. When Elias looked out the window, he saw drifts piled high against the cabin walls and the pines bowing under their white burden. The sky was pale and clear, the kind of crystalline blue that came after a big storm. He'd slept poorly again, his mind too full of thoughts to rest properly. He kept thinking about Clara's story, a widow traveling alone with a child, heading to family out west. It was a hard journey, even in good weather. In winter, it was borderline foolhardy, yet she'd had no choice, or at least felt she had none. Desperation pushed people to brave things. He knew that well enough. Clara was already awake when he rose from his chair. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the snow. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying too much worry for too long. "Storm's done," Elias said by way of greeting. "I see that." She turned to face him. "How long until the trail's passable, do you think?" "Depends. Main drifts will settle some by midday. But 3 feet of fresh snow, that wagon of yours won't move easy. We have to try. We've already lost a day and a half." Anxiety crept into her voice. "I told Thomas we'd arrive by Christmas. He'll be worried. Can't be helped. Weather doesn't care about plans." Elias moved to the stove and started building up the fire for breakfast. "I'll ride down after we eat, see what condition the wagon's in. Might be we can fix it, might be it'll need more than that." Relief softened Clara's face. "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." She nodded, accepting his help with quiet grace. Behind her, Lydia stirred in the bed, making small sounds as she woke. The child sat up, her dark hair tangled, and looked around the cabin with sleepy confusion before remembering where she was. "Mama?" "Right here, sweetheart." Lydia climbed out of bed and padded over, still wearing Elias's oversized shirt. She leaned against her mother's side and Clara wrapped an arm around her. "Is the storm over?" Lydia asked. "It is. Mr. Boone is going to help us with the wagon today." The child looked at Elias with those serious eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Just Elias is fine, child." They ate breakfast together. More cornmeal porridge, this time with a bit of dried apple mixed in. It wasn't much, but they ate it gratefully. Afterward, Elias bundled up in his heavy coat and headed out to Saddle Red. The cold was fierce but clean, that particular bite that came with clear winter days. He slogged through the deep snow to the lean-to, and Red greeted him with a soft nicker. The horse seemed glad for the prospect of activity after being cooped up through the storm. "Got work to do, old friend," Elias murmured as he saddled up. "Wagon to find, probably half buried by now." He led Red out into the snow and mounted up. The horse moved carefully, feeling his way through the drifts. From the cabin door, Clara and Lydia watched. Elias raised a hand to them, and Lydia waved back enthusiastically. The ride down the trail was slow-going. In places, the snow came up to Red's chest, and they had to pick their way carefully around drifts and fallen branches. Everything looked different under all that white, the familiar landmarks buried or transformed. But Elias knew these mountains, and he trusted Red to keep his footing. It took him the better part of an hour to cover what would normally be a 20-minute ride. When he finally spotted the wagon, his heart sank. It sat tilted at a sharp angle, where the trail narrowed between 2 large pines. One wheel was indeed broken, not just cracked but shattered, with several spokes snapped clean through. The wagon bed listed dangerously to one side, and snow had drifted halfway up the sides. But that wasn't the worst of it. The wagon was loaded with supplies, trunks and crates and bundles, all of it now buried under snow and exposed to the elements. Some of the bundles had come loose, their bindings broken, contents spilling out. He could see fabric, tools, what looked like a bag of flour that had burst open. 2 months of traveling, all their worldly possessions, and half of it was damaged or destroyed. Elias dismounted and waded through the snow to examine the situation more closely. The axle was sound, at least, that was something. But the wheel would need to be replaced entirely, and he didn't have a spare wheel up at his cabin. They'd have to go down to Whispering Pines for that, and getting the wagon down the mountain with a broken wheel would be near impossible. He dug through the snow, checking what he could of their supplies. Some things were salvageable. A trunk of clothes that had stayed relatively dry, some cookware, tools. But a lot was ruined. The flour was gone. A sack of beans had split and scattered, and several bundles of fabric were soaked through. He thought about Clara's face, the determination and fear mixed together. She'd sold everything to make this journey, gambled everything on reaching her brother-in-law's ranch. Losing half her supplies would be devastating. Elias spent another hour digging out what he could and assessing the damage. Then he remounted Red and headed back up the mountain, rehearsing in his mind how to break the news gently. When he reached the cabin, Clara must have read something in his face, because her expression fell even before he spoke. "It's bad?" she asked. "Wheels destroyed. Axle's good, but you lost a fair amount of supplies to the storm. Wagon's not going anywhere without a new wheel, and I don't have one to give you." Clara closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears, but her voice stayed steady. "How much did we lose?" "Hard to say exactly. Maybe a third, maybe half. Some things are salvageable if we can get them dried out, and the wheel... We'll need to go to Whispering Pines. The wheelwright there can make you a new one, but it'll take time. A few days at least. I don't have money for a new wheel." Clara's voice was flat. "I spent everything I had on supplies for the journey. We'll figure something out." "How?" The word came out sharp, edged with desperation. "I have nothing to trade, nothing to sell except what's in that wagon, and you just said half of it's ruined. How am I supposed to—" She stopped, pressing her hands to her face, fighting for composure. Lydia had been playing quietly by the fire, but now she looked up, sensing her mother's distress. "Mama!" Clara took a deep breath and lowered her hands. "It's all right, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine." But Elias could see it wasn't fine. Clara was trying to hold herself together, trying to be strong for her daughter, but the weight of it all was crushing her. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror years ago, when Sarah died and the world stopped making sense. "Listen," he said quietly. "I have some money saved. Not much, but enough for a wheel. I'll loan it to you. You can pay me back when you're settled at your brother-in-law's place." "I can't accept that." "You can, and you will. Unless you plan on spending the rest of the winter stuck in my cabin, which I'm sure wasn't part of your plan." Despite everything, Clara let out a short, choked laugh. "No, that wasn't the plan." "Then it's settled. We'll go down to town tomorrow, get the wheel ordered. Should be ready in 3 or 4 days. In the meantime, we'll bring up what we can salvage from your wagon." Clara studied him for a long moment, and he saw her working through some internal calculation, pride versus necessity, independence versus survival. Finally she nodded. "Thank you, Elias. I'll pay you back. Every cent." "I know you will." The rest of the day was spent in practical matters. Elias went back down the trail with his sled and retrieved what he could from the wagon. The trunk of clothes, the tools, the cookware, several bundles that had stayed mostly dry. He made 3 trips, and by the time he hauled the last load up to the cabin, dusk was falling and he was exhausted. Clara and Lydia helped him bring everything inside. They spread the wet things out near the fire to dry and sorted through the rest, taking stock of what they had left. It was sobering. Much of Clara's carefully packed supplies were simply gone. Food, fabric, items she'd planned to trade or sell once they reached Silverton. But Clara didn't break down. She worked methodically, her face set with determination, salvaging what she could and accepting what was lost. Lydia stayed close to her mother, helping where she could, her small face grave. That evening, as they sat around the table eating a sparse supper, Lydia pulled something from the pocket of her dress. It was a small book, its cover stained but intact. "I found this in the wagon," she said, holding it up. "Papa used to read it to me. It was a primer, the kind used to teach children their letters." Clara reached for it, and her hands trembled slightly as she opened the cover. Inside, in faded ink, was an inscription, "To Lydia with love from Papa." "I thought we'd lost this," Clara whispered. "I thought it was gone." "The trunk kept it safe," Elias said. Clara clutched the book to her chest, and finally the tears she'd been holding back began to fall. She wept quietly, and Lydia climbed into her lap and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck. "It's all right, Mama. We still have Papa's book. We still have each other. I know, sweetheart. I know." Elias looked away, giving them privacy in their grief. He busied himself with cleaning up the supper dishes, moving quietly around the cabin. When he glanced back, Clara had composed herself. She wiped her eyes and held Lydia close, stroking her daughter's hair. "I'm sorry," Clara said, meeting Elias's eyes. "I'm sorry you have to see—" "Don't apologize. Grief is grief. No shame in it." She nodded, then stood with Lydia still in her arms. "I think we'll go to bed early tonight. It's been a long day. Good idea. Tomorrow we'll head to town first thing." Clara carried Lydia to the bed and began the process of getting her ready for sleep. Elias sat in his chair by the fire, listening to their quiet voices. Clara reading from the primer, Lydia repeating the words after her. It was a sound that belonged in a home, a sound of teaching and learning and love. Later, after both Clara and Lydia were asleep, Elias rose and crossed quietly to his storage chest. He lifted the lid and carefully moved aside his extra clothes until he reached what lay beneath, a patchwork quilt, folded neatly, smelling faintly of cedar, Sarah's quilt. The one she'd made during their first winter together, stitching it by lamplight while he read to her from books. Each square was a different pattern, different colors, a record of fabric scraps from dresses she'd worn, shirts he'd outgrown, curtains from their first little house. It was beautiful and precious, and he hadn't looked at it since the day he'd packed it away after her death. He ran his fingers over the stitching, remembering Sarah's hands working the needle, her voice humming softly as she sewed. She'd made this quilt with love, with dreams of the family they'd have, the children who'd wrap themselves in it on cold nights. Those children had never come. But here now were a woman and a child who needed warmth, who needed comfort. Sarah would have wanted them to have it. She would have insisted. Elias carried the quilt to the bed and carefully spread it over Clara and Lydia, layering it atop the wool blankets already there. The quilt seemed to glow in the dim firelight, all those colors and patterns coming together into something whole and beautiful. Clara stirred slightly, her hand reaching out to touch the quilt even in sleep. Her fingers traced the stitching, and a small smile crossed her face. Elias returned to his chair and sat watching the fire, feeling the weight of what he'd just done. He'd shared Sarah's quilt. He'd let someone else find comfort in something so precious and personal. Part of him ached with the loss of keeping it to himself, but a larger part felt relief, as if he'd been holding his breath for 10 years and finally exhaled. Sarah wouldn't want her things hidden away. She'd want them used, shared, bringing warmth to people who needed it. She'd always been that way, generous, giving, seeing abundance where others saw scarcity. "I hope I'm doing right," Elias whispered to the fire, to the ghost of his wife, to the silence of the cabin. "I hope this is what you'd want." The fire crackled in response, and for just a moment, Elias could almost feel Sarah there beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice soft in his ear. "Yes, love. This is exactly what I'd want." He closed his eyes and let himself remember her, not with the sharp pain of early grief, but with the gentle ache of love that endures beyond death. He remembered her laugh, her stubbornness, her fierce belief that there was always enough love to go around if people would just open their hearts. Maybe, he thought, she'd sent Clara and Lydia to him. Maybe this was her way of telling him it was time to open his heart again, to stop hiding from life. To remember that love didn't die just because the person was gone. He sat there long into the night, thinking and remembering, while the fire burned low and the two people in his bed slept peacefully under Sarah's quilt, under the protection of a mountain man who was slowly learning that the cure for loneliness wasn't isolation. It was connection. It was opening the door when someone knocked. It was sharing what you had, even when you thought you had nothing left to give. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the winter sky, cold and distant and beautiful. Inside the cabin, 3 people who'd been strangers 3 days ago now slept under the same roof, bound together by circumstance and storms and the simple human need for kindness in a hard world. And in the morning, they would go down the mountain together, taking the first steps toward whatever future waited for them below. The journey to Whispering Pines took most of the morning. The 3 of them rode together, Elias on red with Lydia sitting in front of him, Clara on the sled being pulled behind. It wasn't the most comfortable arrangement, but it got them down the mountain. Lydia chattered most of the way, asking questions about everything they passed. "What kind of tree is that? What do those tracks belong to? Have you ever seen a bear?" Elias answered each question patiently, and found himself surprised by how much he enjoyed it. The child's curiosity was genuine and unaffected, and her delight in the world around her was infectious. Clara said little during the ride, but he could feel her nervousness increasing as they drew closer to town. She sat rigidly on the sled, her hands gripping the edges, her eyes scanning the trail ahead. "You all right?" Elias called back to her during a rest stop, just thinking about how much this wheel is going to cost and how long it'll take. Every day we're delayed is another day Thomas is worrying. Can't be helped. A broken wheel is a broken wheel. I know. I hate being such a burden. You're not a burden, Clara. You're a woman dealing with bad luck and hard weather. Anyone would do the same. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and climbed back onto the sled. Whispering Pines sat in a valley between two ridges, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a main street. It wasn't much of a town, maybe 200 people at most, but it had the essentials: a general store, a smithy, a church, and a handful of houses. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people moved along the street going about their business. As Elias rode into town with Clara and Lydia, heads turned. People stopped what they were doing to stare. Elias Boone hadn't been seen in town with company in over a decade. The sight of him with a woman and child was enough to set tongues wagging immediately. He ignored the stares and headed straight for the smithy, where old Gordon Price worked his forge. Gordon had been the wheelwright in Whispering Pines for 40 years, and there wasn't a wheel he couldn't make or repair. Elias dismounted and helped Lydia down, then offered a hand to Clara as she climbed off the sled. She took it briefly, her fingers cold even through her gloves. The smithy was warm and loud, filled with the ring of hammer on anvil. Gordon looked up from his work when they entered, a big man with massive shoulders and a beard that was pure white. His eyebrows rose when he saw Elias. "Well, I'll be. Elias Boone. Thought you turned into a ghost up on that mountain." His eyes shifted to Clara and Lydia, curious but not unkind. "Who's this you got with you?" Clara Whitmore and her daughter, Lydia. Their wagon broke down on the trail during the storm. "Need a new wheel?" Gordon set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his apron. "Let me guess. You hit that bad stretch about 3 miles up? That section's been taking out wheels all season. Should have been graded last summer, but the county never got around to it." "That's the spot," Clara said. "Cracked first, then just gave out completely in the storm. I'll need to see the old wheel to match the size, but I can make you a new one. Take me about 3 days, maybe 4. Got 2 other jobs ahead of yours." Clara's face fell slightly. 4 days? Could rush it for extra, but I'd still need 2 days minimum. Can't rush good work, ma'am. The regular time is fine, Clara said quietly. How much? For a standard wagon wheel? $15. The color drained from Clara's face. $15 was a fortune, probably a quarter of everything she had left. Elias could see her doing the calculations in her head, trying to figure out if she could afford it, what she'd have to give up before she could speak. Elias said, "Put it on my account, Gordon." "No," Clara said immediately. "I can't let you. We already discussed this. I'm loaning you the money. You'll pay me back when you're settled." His tone left no room for argument. Gordon looked between them, clearly confused by the dynamics, but wise enough not to pry. "All right, then. On your account, Eli. I'll need that broken wheel brought in so I can match it. I'll fetch it this afternoon." "Good enough. Come back in 3 days." They left the smithy and stepped back out into the cold. Clara was silent, her jaw tight. Elias could practically feel the frustration radiating off her, pride and gratitude warring inside her. "I'll pay you back," she said finally. "Every penny. With interest. No interest. Just the $15 when you can manage it. It might take a while." "I'm not going anywhere." Lydia tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, can we see the town, please?" Clara looked like she wanted to refuse, wanted to just hide somewhere until it was time to leave. But she looked down at her daughter's hopeful face and relented. "All right, but stay close." They walked down the main street, Lydia between them, holding both their hands. People continued to stare, and Elias heard the whispers following them. "Look, it's Boone. Who's that woman with him? When did he come down from his mountain?" At the general store, they stopped to buy a few supplies. The storekeeper, Martha Henderson, was a plump woman in her 50s who'd known Elias for years. Her eyes went wide when he walked in with company. Elias Boone, as I live and breathe. And who might these lovely ladies be? Clara Whitmore and her daughter Lydia. They had wagon trouble on the mountain trail. Going to be staying up at my place while Gordon makes them a new wheel. Martha's eyebrows rose, nearly to her hairline, but she was too well-mannered to comment directly. Instead, she turned her attention to Clara with a warm smile. You poor dear. That trail's treacherous this time of year. You're lucky Elias found you. Very lucky, Clara agreed softly. Well, let's get you fixed up with whatever you need. We've got fresh bread just baked this morning, and I think there's still some of that good cheese left. Just some coffee and flour, Clara said quickly. That's all we need. Nonsense. You've had a hard time of it traveling with a little one in winter. Let me put together a proper basket for you. Martha was already moving around the store, pulling items from shelves. Some cornmeal, beans, a bit of salt pork, dried fruit for the child. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate the kindness, but I can't afford. Who said anything about affording? This is neighbors helping neighbors. We take care of our own in Whispering Pines. Martha continued packing a basket, her movements brisk and efficient. Besides, it's just after Christmas. Season of giving and all that. Clara looked overwhelmed, close to tears. Thank you. That's very kind. While Martha finished preparing the basket, Lydia explored the store, her eyes wide at all the items on display. She stopped in front of a jar of peppermint sticks, staring at them with obvious longing. Martha noticed and smiled. Would you like one, sweetheart? Lydia looked to her mother uncertainly. Clara started to shake her head, but Martha was already reaching into the jar. Every child deserves a peppermint stick. Here you go, dear. She handed one to Lydia, who took it reverently. Thank you, ma'am. You're very welcome. When they left the store, Elias carrying the heavy basket of supplies, Clara was quiet again. But this time it wasn't frustration or worry. It was something else. Wonder maybe, or surprise at human kindness. People here are good folk, Elias said, as they walked back toward where he'd left Red. Might seem nosy, but they mean well. I can see that, Clara glanced at him. They seem surprised to see you with us. I don't come to town much. And I've never come with company. Because of your wife? Partly. Mostly I just got used to being alone. Easier to keep to myself than to explain why I didn't want to be social. And now? Elias considered the question. Now I'm thinking maybe I was wrong about a few things. They reached Red, and Elias began loading the supplies onto the sled. As he worked, he noticed a man approaching, tall and lean, wearing a sheriff's badge on his coat. Ben Parker. They'd known each other years ago, back before Sarah died. Elias, Ben said, his voice carefully neutral. Heard you were in town. Wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything's fine, Ben. You're sure? Because folks are talking, seeing you with... He glanced at Clara and Lydia, then back to Elias. Just want to make sure there's no trouble. Elias felt a flash of irritation. No trouble. Mrs. Whitmore's wagon broke down on the mountain trail during the storm. I'm helping her get it fixed. That's all. Ben studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, then. Good to see you, Eli. You should come around more often. Town misses you. Maybe I will. After Ben walked away, Clara said quietly, he thought you'd kidnapped us or something, didn't he? He was just being cautious. Looking out for you, that's kind of him. She paused. You have a lot of people here who care about you, Elias. Why did you shut them all out? Because caring hurts when you lose someone. Seemed easier not to let anyone close. And now? Now I'm realizing that keeping everyone at a distance hurts too, just in a different way. Lydia, who'd been listening quietly while working on her peppermint stick, said, My mama says that people need people. She says that's how we're made. Your mama's a wise woman. The ride back up the mountain was slower, weighed down with supplies. But the sun was shining and the air was crisp. And despite everything, the broken wagon, the lost supplies, the days of delay, there was a sense of peace that Elias hadn't felt in years. When they reached the cabin, Clara helped him unload, while Lydia ran inside to warm up by the fire. They worked in companionable silence, carrying items in and finding places to store everything. Thank you, Clara said when they were done. For the wheel, for the supplies, for all of it. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You already have. You gave me something I didn't know I needed. What's that? A reason to come down from the mountain. Clara smiled, and in that moment, standing in the doorway of his cabin with the afternoon sun lighting her face, she looked almost happy despite all her troubles. Behind her, through the open door, he could see Lydia playing with her doll near the fire, talking to it in her soft voice. This is what a home should feel like, Elias thought. This is what Sarah wanted for this place. Not emptiness and grief, but life and voices and people who needed each other. He didn't know what would happen when the wheel was finished, when Clara and Lydia left for Silverton. He didn't know if he'd go back to his solitary life or if something had changed permanently. But for now, for these few days, he had this, the sound of a child playing, the presence of another adult, the simple comfort of not being alone, and that, he decided, was enough. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Elias would rise early to tend the fire and see to Red, while Clara made coffee and prepared breakfast. Lydia would wake to the smell of food cooking and pad over to the table, still sleepy-eyed, clutching her wooden doll. They'd eat together, making plans for the day, then set about their tasks. Clara proved to be remarkably capable. She cleaned without being asked, organized the cabin's stores with practical efficiency, and could cook a decent meal from the scant ingredients available. She mended clothes, including some of Elias's shirts that he'd ignored for months. Their tears and missing buttons suddenly made right. Lydia was everywhere at once, curious, helpful, and surprisingly good company. She asked to help with everything, from fetching water to splitting kindling. Elias showed her how to do things properly, how to stack wood so it would dry, how to tell which eggs from his small henhouse were fresh. She absorbed every lesson with serious concentration, as if she were learning secrets of the universe. On the second day, while Clara was washing clothes, Lydia found Elias's old leather journal tucked on a shelf. It was worn and faded, the pages yellowed with age. She brought it to him with both hands, treating it like something precious. "What's this?" she asked. Elias took the journal, surprised he'd forgotten about it. "Just some old notes. From when I was younger? Can I see?" He almost said no. The journal held pieces of a life he'd left behind, dreams and plans that had died with Sarah. But Lydia's eyes were so earnest, so full of genuine interest, that he found himself opening it. The pages were covered with sketches and notes. Horse training techniques, plans for a barn, estimates for fencing, a rough map showing where he'd planned to build a house, where the pastures would go, where the garden would be planted, all the pieces of the ranch he and Sarah had dreamed of creating. "You can draw," Lydia exclaimed, pointing to a sketch of a horse in mid-gallop. "That's so good. That's Thunder. Best horse I ever trained. Belonged to the Brennan family down in town." Lydia flipped through more pages, studying each drawing with care. "What's this place?" She pointed to the map. "That's—" Elias paused, old grief rising up. "That's a piece of land your mother and I—" He stopped, realizing his error. "I mean, my wife and I, we were going to buy it. Build a ranch. Why didn't you?" "She died before we could." Lydia absorbed this with the gravity of someone twice her age. "That's sad." "It is, but you could still do it. You could still build the ranch." "I'm too old for that now." "No, you're not." She said it with such certainty that Elias almost believed her. "My papa always said it's never too late to chase a dream. He said the only thing that stops dreams is when people stop chasing them." Elias looked at this small girl with her wooden doll and her simple wisdom and felt something crack inside his chest. When had he stopped chasing dreams? When had he decided his life was over just because Sarah's had ended? "Your papa was a smart man." "I think so too." Lydia handed the journal back to him carefully. "Will you tell me about the horses? About how you trained them?" So he did. They sat by the fire while Clara worked, and Elias told stories he hadn't thought about in years. About breaking his first Mustang at age 16. About the time a stallion named Demon threw him into a fence and broke his arm, and how he'd climbed right back on once the arm healed. About the gentle mare named Sweet Pea, who'd been everyone's favorite. So calm you could stand on her back and she wouldn't even flinch. Lydia listened raptly, asking questions, laughing at the funny parts, gasping at the dangerous ones. And Elias found himself enjoying the telling, reliving those days when he'd been young and strong and full of confidence that the world would bend to his will if he just worked hard enough. Clara listened too, while she worked. When Elias caught her eye, she smiled, and he saw gratitude there, not just for the shelter and help, but for giving her daughter something precious: stories, attention, a sense that the world was bigger than just their small wagon and their uncertain journey. That evening, after supper, Lydia asked if Elias would teach her to carve. She held up her wooden doll. "Papa made this. I want to learn how, so I can make things too. So I don't forget." Elias looked at Clara, who nodded permission. He fetched his knife and a small piece of soft pine, then showed Lydia how to hold the knife properly, how to cut away from herself, how to let the wood tell you what it wanted to be. "You don't force it," he explained, demonstrating with careful strokes. "You work with the grain, see? You listen to the wood." Lydia watched intently, then tried it herself under his close supervision. Her first cuts were clumsy, but she had patience. She worked slowly, carefully, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Clara sat across from them, mending a dress by lamplight, and the scene felt so natural, so right, that Elias had to remind himself this was temporary. In a day or two the wheel would be ready. Clara and Lydia would leave. The cabin would be empty again, silent again. The thought made his chest ache. Later, after Lydia had been tucked into bed, Clara joined Elias by the fire. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of burning wood. "She's getting attached to you," Clara said finally. "Lydia, I mean. I'm sorry. I can pull back if—" "No," Clara shook her head. "Don't apologize. It's good for her. She hasn't had a man in her life since James died. She needs—" her voice caught slightly. "She needs someone to show her that not all men leave. I don't want to hurt her. When you go—" "I know, but the hurt of saying goodbye to someone good is better than never having known them at all." Clara looked at him in the firelight. "You're good with her, natural. Did you and your wife want children?" "We did, more than anything. But it never happened for us. I'm sorry. I made my peace with it. Or thought I had." Elias stared into the fire. "Being around Lydia, it reminds me what I missed. What Sarah missed. She would have been a wonderful mother, I think. She would have been." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. This brother-in-law of yours, Thomas. What's he like?" Clara's expression shifted, became carefully neutral. "I don't actually know him well. I only met him once at our wedding. He seemed kind enough. He and James were close when they were younger, but it's been 2 years since James died. Thomas wrote and said we were welcome, that he'd help us get settled. But I sometimes wonder—" She stopped, looking troubled. "Wonder what?" "If we're a burden he's being too polite to refuse. A widow and a child showing up, needing housing and help. It's a lot to ask of anyone, even family. If he invited you, he must have meant it. I hope so. Because if he didn't—" Clara wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't have anywhere else to go, Elias. This is our only chance." The vulnerability in her voice caught him off guard. Clara was so strong, so determined, that it was easy to forget how frightened she must be underneath. She was gambling everything on the kindness of a man she barely knew, traveling through dangerous country with a small child, hoping desperately that someone would catch her when she fell. "It'll work out," Elias said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "You'll get to Silverton, and Thomas will welcome you, and you'll build a new life there. I hope you're right." They sat in silence again, but it wasn't quite as comfortable as before. Something hung in the air between them now, unspoken worries, uncertain futures. Finally Clara rose. "I should sleep. Long day tomorrow." "Clara," Elias spoke before he could stop himself. "If things don't work out in Silverton, if Thomas can't help you, you could—" He stopped, unsure how to finish. "I could what?" "You could come back here, just until you figured something else out." Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. "That's kind of you. But you've done enough. More than enough. The offer stands. Just in case," she nodded slowly. "Thank you. I'll remember that. After she'd gone to bed, Elias sat alone by the fire, thinking about what he'd just offered. Was he serious? Would he really let Clara and Lydia come back if they needed to? Let them stay indefinitely? The old Elias, the one who'd built this cabin to escape the world, would have said no, would have kept his distance, protected his solitude. But that Elias was fading, replaced by someone who remembered what it felt like to be needed, to have purpose beyond mere survival. Someone who realized that the cabin he'd built to keep the world out had become a prison of his own making. He looked at the wooden box on his bedside table, the one holding Sarah's ring. For 10 years, he'd kept it closed, afraid that opening it would unleash grief he couldn't control. But now he stood and crossed to it, lifting the lid slowly. The ring sat there on its leather bed, gleaming dully in the firelight. He picked it up, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a small thing, such a simple band of gold, but it had meant everything once. "I'm trying, Sarah," he whispered. "I'm trying to do what you'd want, to help them, to be the man you married instead of the ghost I became." The ring offered no answer, but he hadn't really expected one. He held it for a moment longer, then carefully placed it back in the box. But this time he didn't close the lid. He left it open, a small acknowledgement that he was ready to let light in, ready to stop hiding from his own heart. Outside, the night was cold and clear. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Inside the cabin, 3 people slept or tried to sleep, each carrying their own hopes and fears and questions about what tomorrow would bring. The wheel would be ready soon. The wagon would be fixed. Clara and Lydia would continue their journey, but something had changed during these days together. Something that couldn't be undone or forgotten. 3 strangers had become something more, not quite family, but not strangers anymore either. And for Elias Boone, who'd spent 10 years convinced he needed no one, the thought of the cabin being empty again felt unbearable. He added another log to the fire and settled into his chair, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. Tomorrow, they'd go to town and pick up the wheel. Tomorrow, they'd start the process of saying goodbye. But tonight he had this. The sound of breathing from the bed, the presence of life in his home, the knowledge that for a few days at least he'd mattered to someone, and that would have to be enough. On the 4th morning, they returned to Whispering Pines to collect the wheel. The ride down was quieter than previous trips, all 3 of them feeling the weight of what came next. Once they had the wheel, there would be no reason to delay. Clara and Lydia would pack up, fix the wagon, and continue their journey to Silverton. Gordon had the wheel ready, a beautiful piece of work with perfectly fitted spokes and a solid iron rim. He helped Elias load it onto the sled, then stood with his hands on his hips, looking satisfied. "That'll hold you all the way to California if you treat it right," he told Clara. "Just watch for those deep ruts and you'll be fine." "Thank you, Mr. Price." "Gordon, please." "And you take care, ma'am. Travel safe." They stopped at Martha's store for a few last supplies. The storekeeper fussed over them, pressing extra food into their hands and refusing payment for half of it. "You've got a long road ahead," she said firmly. "Consider it insurance. I'll sleep better knowing you're well fed." As they were leaving, Martha caught Elias's arm and pulled him aside. "That's a good woman," she said quietly. "And that child is a treasure. Seems to me they could use someone steady in their lives. They've got family in Silverton, family they barely know. Family that might or might not want the burden of 2 more mouths to feed." Martha gave him a pointed look. "I'm just saying, if you wanted to give them a reason to stay, I don't think anyone would blame you." "Martha, I know. Mind my own business. But Elias, I've known you for 20 years. I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at that little girl. And I've never seen you smile the way you did when you walked in here with them. Sarah would want you to be happy. She'd want you to have a life. She wouldn't want you dying alone in that mountain cabin with nothing but regrets for company." Martha squeezed his arm. "Think about it. That's all I'm asking." She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing there with her words echoing in his head. The journey back up the mountain took most of the afternoon. They'd have to work quickly to get the wagon repaired before dark. When they reached the site of the broken wagon, now partially dug out from the snow, Elias assessed the work ahead. "I'll need to jack it up, pull off the broken wheel, fit the new one," he said. "Gonna take a few hours." "We'll help," Clara said. "Just tell us what to do." They worked together as the afternoon light faded. Elias used his jack to lift the wagon while Clara steadied it. Lydia handed them tools as needed, taking her role as assistant very seriously. The broken wheel came off with some effort, its shattered spokes a stark reminder of how close Clara and Lydia had come to disaster. The new wheel slid into place smoothly, and Elias tightened everything down with practiced hands. When he finally lowered the jack and stepped back, the wagon sat level and solid. "That should do it," he said. "Give it a test." Clara climbed onto the wagon seat and urged the horses forward. They'd survived the storm tied to a tree, and though they were thin and cranky about it, they were sound enough. The wagon rolled forward smoothly, the new wheel turning true. "It's perfect," Clara called down. "Thank you." They loaded the salvaged supplies back into the wagon, working in the gathering dusk. When everything was secured, Clara stood looking at her wagon with an expression Elias couldn't quite read. "I should go," she said finally. "Get a few miles in before full dark. There's enough moonlight to travel by." "You could stay one more night," Elias heard himself say. "Start fresh in the morning." Clara looked at him, and he saw the same conflict he felt reflected in her eyes. "If I stay another night, it'll be that much harder to leave. Would that be so bad?" "Elias," she stopped, struggling with words. "You've been so kind, too kind. But Lydia and I have to make our own way. We can't keep depending on your generosity. What if it's not just generosity?" The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced toward Lydia, who was feeding the horses some grain, out of earshot. "Don't," Clara said softly. "Please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm just saying you have options. You don't have to go to Silverton if what? If I want to stay here and play house with a man I've known for less than a week." Her voice was sharper now, edged with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "That's not how life works, Elias. I have to think about Lydia, about her future. Thomas can offer us stability, a real home, a community. What can you offer? A cabin in the mountains and a man who's been hiding from the world for 10 years. Her words stung because they were true. What could he offer them? He had no ranch, no prospects, nothing but his solitary existence and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "No, I'm sorry." Clara pressed her hands to her face. "I didn't mean it like that. You've been wonderful. You've saved our lives, probably, and you've shown Lydia kindness when she needed it most. It's just—" She lowered her hands, and he saw tears in her eyes. "It would be so easy to stay. So easy to let you take care of us. But I have to be strong. I have to do this on my own. You don't have to do everything on your own." "Yes, I do. Because if I don't, if I let myself depend on someone, what happens when they leave? When they die? I can't." Her voice broke. "I can't lose someone else, Elias. I can't let Lydia lose someone else. It's better to just keep moving, keep going toward the life James wanted for us." Before Elias could respond, Lydia came running over. "Mama, are we leaving now?" Clara wiped her eyes quickly and forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart." "Say thank you to Elias." Lydia turned to him and her face crumpled. "Do we have to go?" "Your mama thinks it's best, but I don't want to go. I like it here. I like you." The child's voice rose, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Can't we just stay?" "Lydia." Clara reached for her daughter, but Lydia pulled away. "No. It's not fair. Papa died, and now we have to leave Elias too, and I don't want to." She was crying hard now, the tears of a child who'd been brave for too long and finally reached her breaking point. Clara looked stricken. "Sweetheart, please." Elias knelt down to Lydia's level. "Hey now, listen to me." The child looked at him through her tears, her face red and blotchy. "Your mama's doing what she thinks is right," Elias said gently. "She's trying to get you to a place where you'll be safe and have a real home. That's what parents do. They make the hard choices because they love their children. You understand?" Lydia nodded miserably. "And I'm not going anywhere." I'll be right here on this mountain. If you ever need me, you know where to find me. All right? But we're going so far away. Far isn't forever. People come back sometimes, and even if they don't, the time you spend with someone matters. It doesn't disappear just because you say goodbye. He pulled her into a hug, and she clung to him, crying into his shoulder. Over her head, he met Clara's eyes and saw her crying too, silent tears streaming down her face. After a long moment, Lydia pulled back and wiped her nose on her sleeve. "I'm going to remember you," she said solemnly. "Forever and ever. I'll remember you too, Miss Lydia. You take care of your mama, all right? She's going to need you to be strong." "I will." Elias stood and pulled something from his pocket, the small wooden horse he'd carved years ago, the one meant for the children he and Sarah never had. He'd fetched it from the hope chest that morning, somehow knowing this moment would come. "I want you to have this," he said, pressing it into Lydia's hands. "Your papa would have wanted you to have something to remember him by, and this was carved with love for a child who deserved it." Lydia looked at the horse, running her fingers over the smooth wood, the carefully carved mane and tail. "It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as your papa's doll, but maybe they can be friends. Mama Grace can ride the horse." Despite her tears, Lydia smiled. "Thank you, Elias." Clara was barely holding herself together. She picked Lydia up and held her close, then looked at Elias. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "You already have. You reminded me what it feels like to be alive." She set Lydia down and climbed onto the wagon seat, then helped her daughter up beside her. The horses stamped impatiently, ready to move after days of standing still. Clara gathered the reins. But before she could snap them, Elias called out, "Clara, wait." She looked down at him. "When you get to Silverton, send word that you arrived safely. Care of Martha Henderson's store. She'll make sure I get it. I will. And if things don't work out with Thomas, I know. I have somewhere to come back to." She smiled through her tears. "Thank you for that. Even if I never take you up on it, thank you for offering." She snapped the reins, and the horses started forward. The wagon rolled down the trail, its new wheel turning smoothly, carrying Clara and Lydia away into the gathering darkness. Elias stood watching until they disappeared around a bend, until even the sound of the wagon faded into silence. Then he stood there longer still, as night fell completely and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Red stood patiently nearby, waiting. Finally, Elias mounted up and turned toward his cabin. The ride back felt longer than it should have, the trail darker, the cold more bitter. When he reached the cabin and went inside, the emptiness hit him like a physical blow. The fire had burned down to coals. The table that had held 3 plates for the past few days now held none. The bed that had sheltered Clara and Lydia under Sarah's quilt was empty, the blankets folded neatly at the foot. They'd left no trace of their presence, except for a small piece of folded paper on the table. Elias picked it up and opened it to find a note in Clara's careful handwriting. "Elias, thank you for reminding us that there is still goodness in the world. We will never forget you. Yours in gratitude, Clara and Lydia." He read it 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the wooden box beside Sarah's ring. 2 precious things now, reminders of 2 different kinds of love. The love he'd lost and the love he'd let walk away. He built up the fire and sat in his chair, staring into the flames. The cabin had never felt emptier. For 10 years, he'd lived in this silence, believing it was what he wanted. Now, after just a few days of having company, the silence felt suffocating. Martha's words came back to him. "If you wanted to give them a reason to stay, I don't think anyone would blame you, but what reason could he give?" Clara was right. What did he have to offer? A cabin in the mountains and a broken heart slowly learning to beat again. No, she deserved better. She and Lydia both deserved better than a man still half in love with a ghost. Elias sat there long into the night, listening to the wind howl through the pines, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life by letting them go. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the wagon tracks on the trail, erasing all evidence that anyone had ever passed through at all.